Hello, hello. Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here after seeing some of the presentations this morning. I'm just really delighted to take part in this, to be in such good company, such great fermentation company. These presentations are really exciting. And when Trevor asked me to participate in this, the concept of fermenting change for food justice was just absolutely an exciting opportunity for me to be involved. So I hope that everybody has a chance to donate today to support the fundraising for the Black-led and BIPOC national and international organizations that are being supported today. I'm going to share my screen here. So get into this talk. All right. Okay, so again, I'm Sean Nash, and I'm a visual artist. I make sculptures that house fermented foods, living fermented foods, in the gallery and in non-traditional art settings. And so what that often means is that I'll have people eating in the gallery and observing fermented foods as they change, or becoming part of the exhibition by bringing their own ferments and their fermentation knowledge to the context of the show. I am also a professor at the Kansas City Art Institute. I've been teaching there for 4 years. I head the social practice program there. We have a minor in social practice. And so I've lived in the Kansas City area. And if you're not familiar, it straddles Kansas and Missouri in the central United States. So my talk is going to be a little bit different today, probably a different kind of process-oriented talk. It's titled Transfermentation: Embodied Processes of Fermentation, Art, and Transbecoming. So in this talk, I want to draw links between my trans identity, fermentation, and my art practice, starting with a description of what social practice is and an understanding of microbes as being sociable, then ending with a concept of queer and trans perenniality. So introducing in my bio, the interdisciplinary field of social practice. That's an expansive artistic approach that regards the social as a significant material in artistic discourse and practice. Social, political, and community practices have become increasingly of interest and increasingly necessary as artists question traditional materials and methods and their function in a capitalist system. So although social practice is not always aligned with social justice, food justice, the topic and cause of this event, is central to a lot of the projects that fall within the discipline. The organizations that are being supported by donations to this event today are creating and sustaining necessary culture, heritage, and traditions, and most can be considered for that reason under the umbrella of social practice art. And because I'm addressing trans identity and fermentation today, I want to plug just one of the organizations. If you haven't heard of it yet, it's called the Okra Project. And their description is that they are a collective that seeks to address the global crisis faced by Black trans people by bringing home-cooked, healthy, and culturally specific meals and resources to Black trans people wherever we can reach them. So I really admire the work of the Okra Project in that it uses the symbol of this critical ancestral food connecting to trans identities, diversity, and care. And I also really love growing and fermenting okra in my community garden, which you're actually seeing a picture of now. So my artistic work started consciously incorporating the social when I discovered fermentation as a catalyst and a medium to build relationships of discovery and experimentation. In 2014, I attended a 3-week residency at Sandor Katz's Foundation for Fermentation Fervor. And the memory of us 12 residents seen here sitting around his concrete tabletop kitchen island, peering into jars and bowls, over cutting boards and mounds of vegetables, grains, pots of milk, and sundry recycled bottles for ferments. That's imprinted into my mind as a moment of deep listening, of love, attention, and care. Our sets of eyes, mouths, ears, fingers, skin, smells, and humanity is commingling there at this preparatory table with a vast history of life, of preservation, and of agriculture. Our sociability, indeed our ability to create, is bound with the tiny organisms that we know presently exist on all surfaces, in front of us, and also the interiors too. So when we ferment, we're imagining their futures, and we experiment with ideal habitats for microbes' short and shifting lives. The social then is not limited to humans. So I identify my social practice as inclusive of the microbial and the non-human. The ways in which microbes, particularly bacteria, are social is noticed through scientific understanding of how bacteria communicate through chemical signals. They are capable of group decision-making and coordination through quorum sensing. And by way of understanding these processes, their sociability and all that that entails can take root and supplant this singular narrative of competition, combat, and warfare that has been the norm for the bacterial and microbial world for so long. Bacteria are the original living communicators. Observation of bacterial communication and behaviors is studied under different conditions. And the study of genetic material directly from environmental samples, called metagenomics, that gives us more analysis of the context for all the ways that microbes act systemically in concert as ecosystems outside of a laboratory context. This is important because it is a scientific recognition of the vast intelligence of Earth systems, and our severance from many of these systems has had a profound effect on our nervous systems and our psychology. It's also a glimpse at the recognition of indigenous and traditional knowledge using attuned perception and observation with expansive and active language to describe processes and energy instead of strictly isolating and objectifying things, living things. So we've been constantly reminded this year in the context of COVID that being human means being in relationship with vast numbers of non-human organisms and particles. Our health, consciousness, psychology, and our bodies and physical states are tied to the web of more than human relationships of being. One of the first books I read to further my science studies education involving the microbial was The Origins of Sociable Life by Myra Hurd. The first words of her introduction include the terms micro-ontologies and the microcosmos. These terms and the inspiration to become bacteriocentric, that's a term of the microbiologist Betsy Dexter Dyer, they conjured scales of relationships and a queering of bodies through the consideration that the microbial beings have an ontology within an ontology. So my first show of sculptures with fermented foods was titled They, Them, There. That was a reflection on the fragmentation of binary gender categories and the expansion and multiplicity of gender in the human world. I framed the use of these plural pronouns as presciently extending the concept to include our commensal microbiota in our knowledge of humanness, and also to how we understand gender. Knowledge of the microbiome was gaining popular momentum at the same time as trans, non-binary, and fluid gender identities and pronouns started becoming more recognized, publicized, or feared in mainstream culture. So with they, them, there, I wanted to think through gender in the context of these multi-species relationships. If there are an average of 39 trillion microbial cells in the human body compared to 30 trillion human cells, that makes us more microbe than human. The pronouns they, them, their can kind of wink and nod at our plurality and our multitudes, making us all they, them, their. With that group of sculptures and then in subsequent exhibitions, I've wanted to visually translate meditations on deep time through a sense of awe in the works that I make. I seek to create artworks and situations where microbes and their materials become the uncanny figure, the focal point of looking and calling into question the living and the non-living in the landscape of a sculpture. So the experience of the sculpture becomes about questioning what's living and what isn't, as it often does. Then does the sculpture itself also become a kind of living thing in that context? Do we have a place there in the sculptures to question the ontology of all substances by the nature of their proximity and our only kind of knowing what things actually are? This relationship to not knowing and not presuming must be a continual practice to acknowledge that our perceptions and projections are part of an exchange that is identity, and that all sets of relationships require slowing down, pausing, and being open and available to listening and sensing. So working with the slow process of fermentation keeps teaching me just that. If I find myself in a product-oriented relationship with fermentation rather than a process-oriented one, it can result in a botched step or some overload of anxiety that somehow, especially with sourdough, microbes can sense, I think. My personal story of finally tending to my trans identity, acknowledging it at a later age, occurred around the time I began fermenting, about 6 years ago. I've connected those experiences as they arose out of a deep need for change, and because my relationship with the world and with other people needed to radically shift. I connect them too to a sense of care that started to include myself more centrally. At the time, I started using non-binary pronouns and became more aware of my deep trouble and dissatisfaction with the disconnect in the way that people perceive me. And I know I felt happier with the way I related to microbes than to other humans. Fermentation was teaching me that. Fermenting food is a form of liberatory practice. The process is married with the practical, theoretical, and prophetic narratives that connect ancestry with our possibility for an awakened collective future. It's an embodied practice, among others, that give us strength in physical and mental health and may allow us to build worlds that divest from exploitation, so needed right now. Part of my own liberatory path with fermentation has been the navigation of deep-rooted, deep-seated ideas about ownership, authorship, competitiveness, and authenticity. In grad school, I had yearned deeply for collaborative and collective experiences, but it wasn't until 10 years after graduating that I found what I was looking for in this community of people who were bit by the fermentation bug. We may know Sandor Katz as a huge figure who's authored best-selling books on fermentation, but his book, The Art of Fermentation in particular, demonstrates collective knowledge sourcing and archiving that decentralizes a totality of authorship and ownership of the technology of food fermentation. He makes that really clear, that it's a social, activist, and sometimes political process. I've found that this discourse has allowed me to cut the threads of certain ideas about authorship and ownership while strengthening and tangling others that have been important to naming my trans identity. So along with the medicine I choose to take, the stories of kin, of collective becoming, and becoming with microbes are other forms of potent medicine that have allowed me to feel part of, rather than separate from, a larger collective consciousness. So sometime after that fermentation residency in 2014, my friend Stephanie Maroney, who is a feminist food studies scholar, she asked me to collaborate on an essay describing our time at that residency. And we wrote about the queerness and the felt corporeality of the experience in this essay, Bubbling Bodies and Queer Microbes, Dispatches from the Foundation for Fermentation Fervor. We reflected on the queer and transgender fermenters, gardeners, and builders from intentional communities near the residency, and noted that the experience of fermenting there was linked with a sense of possibility, of freedom, and of liberation. We submitted the essay to an artist call for submissions, a publication titled Fermenting Feminism, which was the curatorial, or is the curatorial project of Lauren Fournier that's been going on since 2016. And in 2017, I worked with Lauren to bring the project to Front Space in Kansas City as a gallery exhibition that has traveled around the world in different forms. And through the visionary concept of her project, I was introduced to an expansive creative world of artists and their performative acts with fermentation, along with those of authors and researchers who are stretching the worlds of feminism and fermentation alike. I highly encourage you to look into Lauren's work on fermenting feminism, as well as Stephanie Maroney's and others. As much as I clearly honor microbes, I want to also honor my collaborators, my friends, my mentors and guides who have shown me these incredibly expansive ways of thinking and ways of being with myself and others. With some retrospect, I can see how this supportive community of friends and practitioners provided me with insight and tools to take action to feel more at home in my own body. Trans and queer identities are part of the biodiversity of life and complex ecosystems. If we see the full spectrum of life and non-life as interconnected, and then we expand that a little bit more, and we expand that a little bit more, widening that stage to then come home, I hope, to local, we may see and employ those woven scales in our technologies. The crisis of climate change and an unstable or uncertain immediate future is not separate from embracing the existence and lives of gender diverse people and our expression and agency. Scholar Donna Haraway uses the theoretical approach of the tentacular in her book, Staying with the Trouble. So the tentacular is an organic and malleable alternative to world build, modeled by many-legged creatures, hyphae, networks, in the shadow of the Anthropocene. What this means is that as practitioners working within the world of fungi and bacteria, if we're clued into a little bit, at least, of the science, we can easily be turned on to imagining sex and chromosomal variation as the rule and not the exception. Fermentation spills over into daily activities and interactions. Purely mechanical and procedural steps with wild fermentation yield less innovative results than intuitive and experimental ones, in my opinion. I've witnessed this as a life philosophy among so many of my fermenter friends. This kind of practice encourages tentacular thinking, resulting in skillful interactions with human and non-human relationships. Fermentation provides a hands-on education of sex and gender diversity, a necessary rewiring of science studies on a fundamental level. So imagine if all children received an education cultivating mushrooms and fermenting in order to engage in discussion about types of reproduction, chromosomal diversity by the tens of thousands, and symbiosis. That's sex ed. And as ecosexual artists Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle have said, compost is so hot. Lately, I've been meditating on a concept of queer perenniality, emerging in my thinking from some of the concepts I've presented so far. Queer and trans perenniality connects queer and trans theory with ecology, as in queer ecology, science studies, and the experience of time, temporality. Perennials are a really hot topic at our home, where my wife is obsessed with creating a native perennial garden and getting to know intimately the names and rhythms of each plant she has introduced, and then those that she wishes to. The area where we live is, or was, a vast prairie ecosystem whose importance and existence was not only overlooked, but violently diminished and eradicated. We both feel intimately at home with the prairie and its stabilizing wildness. The temporality of being at home in this place and imagining roots, networks, as vast and secure as the perennials that have taken hold, that feels like a secret, a queer secret, that here in Kansas, we know our intimate connection to the earth and that we are kin with this delicate percentage of untouched and restored prairie wildflowers and grasses. So to go a little further into this idea, I want to use a section of text from Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz, where he discusses the work of performance artist Caleb Lindsay. And he says, "There's something Black about waiting. There's something queer, Latino, and transgender about waiting. Furthermore, there's something disabled, indigenous, Asian, poor, and so forth about waiting. Those who wait are those of us who are out of time in at least two ways. We've been cast out of straight time's rhythm, and we have made worlds in our temporal and spatial configurations. Certainly, this will be the time of post-coloniality. It seems like the other's time is always off. Often we are the first ones there and the last ones to leave. The essential point here is that our temporalities are different and outside. They are practice failure and virtuosic." So although he's discussing something really different than queer perenniality, I loved the application of the idea of waiting to perenniality and fermentation here. And if perennial means lasting and existing, recurring, I view the intersection of queer and trans identity and perenniality located in a beautifully deep and persistent material bond that resonates with the natural, radically against any notion that anything is unnatural. Fermentation, too, is slow. It involves waiting. You can salivate, imagining something that will take years to ferment, a mead, a wild brew, a miso, for the balance of ecosystems in a jar to merge into those flavors that we have adapted and evolved to enjoy. So I'm going to end with just a practical kind of introduction of a grain that I've been working with. This is an experimental perennial grain called Kernza. You can get Kernza through the perennial pantry. It costs about as much as a bag of coffee. It's an intermediate wheatgrass, and it is being domesticated, which again is going to involve a lot of waiting, decades more perhaps. It's not genetically modified. So Kernza has been bred right here in Kansas at the Land Institute in the middle of Kansas since about 2003. There are experimental Kernza crops being grown internationally, so it's this international science project. Its root systems grow up to 10 feet deep, and since there's no soil disturbance with this crop, the crop is actually sequestering carbon. So I'm experimenting with fermenting Kernza and taking part in their citizen science project for collecting recipes so that this can develop and they can learn more about the uses for Kernza. So I'm excited to ferment with it. I tried a recent batch of Injera that it didn't have the results I was looking for when I went to cook it, but after milling this this grain, it practically fermented itself, making a batter, essentially a starter. It started bubbling within like an hour. So I'm really excited about this, and it's clear that the sort of microbial properties are, it's just alive. It's alive. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the ways that this perhaps is going to change agriculture and food justice as we know it. And this is a kind of long view for the ways that we need to invest in changing our food futures. And I'm going to end with that and my website so that we can have some discussion about a lot of the things that I just threw out there. I hope there's some exciting questions. I have not seen the comments because I can't pay attention to all of that. So maybe we've been collecting them. This is my website, and you can find me on Instagram at NashSE. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to the group.
So that was amazing, Sean. And I did not see any specific questions. Ishi just asked for a reading list of the works you cited today. But we can let some questions flow through, give it a couple minutes.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about anything. I've brought, so I'm in my studio, and I kind of have bits of my sculptures around me. One of the last slides was for a show that I had at Brandeis University at the Knisnik Gallery. It was called Crowdsourcing. And the two sculptures that you see here, they were in the gallery and at the much taller ceilings. And at the bottom of them, each had a corresponding kraut. At that show, I asked people in the Boston area to bring fermented, any lacto-fermented kraut or kraut chi to make a big, I was calling it stone kraut. So we mixed all the krauts together, made a collective kraut, and we tried that kraut. I don't know if anybody is on the call today who took part in that, but if you are and want to say hi. Yeah, so that was a really exciting show to see people, bringing 4-year-old krauts or 1-year-old kraut. And I also did some microscopy at that show. So we looked at a kraut that I had just made under the microscope, and then we looked at this big collective kraut, and it was just teeming with stuff. Will, thank you. Will participated in that. I will definitely provide a reading list. How about I do that on Instagram? I'll put everything on there. So other ferments, I do all kinds of stuff. So over here, I'm a gardener as well. A lot of the time, well, yeah, so I'll seasonally ferment, right? I'll do lacto fermentation based on seasonal stuff. And so I'm looking forward always to that midsummer cucumber and okra. After the cucumber's done, the okra's really in high swing. And so those are my moments for vegetable fermentation, really. But over here I have some green tomatoes. I make all kinds of things. I've got a red kraut here with fennel and apples. So sometimes I do like a sweeter one. And then I put these things down here just for everyone to see them as part of this, but normally they live like in the kitchen. I do make kimchi, and I always have a kimchi. I always have some sauerkraut. I love making tempeh. Those are my regulars. Tempeh is a regular. I do sourdough, but I'm not always the greatest at keeping up with it. And I love it when it feels really good to do it, but sometimes I kind of get overwhelmed by sourdough. I don't know if anyone else feels that way. It's such a process. Thank you for the shirt comment. And anybody can come off mic too to ask questions if you want to engage. If there were any questions or discussion from what I had to talk about today.
Yeah, people are automatically on mute, but you can raise your hand or
Oh,
request to be unmuted. And yeah, we can definitely make this more of a conversation. Just want to prevent lots of noise and potential trolls, I guess.
well, yeah.
um,
Okay.
I
That's
have
fine.
a question, and I'm curious if, even though you have an essay about this, but I was curious about the bubbling bodies and clear microbes reflection on your time at Sanders Place, and wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a short essay. It ended up being published like 3 pages. It's really poetic. Not really, so much of an analysis as this kind of. We wanted it to feel like what it felt like to be there, and I think Stephanie and I both had just such a kind of magical time. I mean, for one, I had this is not directly related to the essay, but I had left a job that I had had in New York City for 6 years to change what I was doing. I was kind of in a rut in my studio practice and just in my life professionally. I was sick of this job, so I quit and I went to this 3 week residency. And I don't think he offered a 3 week residency again because it was probably really hard for him to do. Um, but that alone kind of set me up to just have this really earth moving experience with being there and learning, just immersing in fermentation for 3 weeks. Like, we were camping outside with all the bugs that come in the Tennessee summer. I'm from Tennessee, and so I was born in Memphis, and Sandor's communities in Middle Tennessee, and I have relatives, and my family's still in Tennessee. I had this connection. Let's say when I was younger, I really wanted to leave Tennessee, right? But I went to the University of Tennessee at Knoxville for college, um, and during college, I was working at a food co-op, and people would come through and mention all the intentional communities that exist in Tennessee. I had one person stay with me once who was kind of passing through. So I was always really fascinated with this magical radical fairy community that was talked about, um, and the intentional communities that were sort of, at least in the food co-op world, like kind of idolized, because everyone was living, or the imagination was that people were living these really ethical lives. But I didn't get a chance to go until I went to the fermentation residency. So it was kind of a homecoming to take part in that, and to take part in like queer Tennessee. That was really, really important for me to see ways of those roots, those particular familial roots, and expanding those notions of family, chosen family. That was part of it. That was part of that feeling of liberation. That I mean, I nothing to do with my own personal family. My growing up was great, but Tennessee, it was a hard place to be queer in retrospect. Um, so that is part of the essay, without directly answering some of the details. And that essay is on my website as well. I think you can find it around, but I'd be happy to send it to anyone if you also want to just message me. I'm going to answer some of these questions that have come up. So Colin asked about gut health. Yeah, I mean, my diet has just changed over the years too. So I have had better gut health. It's kind of hard to say without keeping a journal and writing everything down and kind of knowing like the markers of everything. But I have um, certainly experienced like better physical health and well-being. I think for me, it's sort of more about eating like whole foods, just a really whole food, unprocessed food diet, and focusing on fiber and preparing whole foods. So fermentation is part of that, absolutely, and the benefits of fermentation are in there. But I kind of use them more as a condiment. They're a regular part of my diet, but I wouldn't say that they're like the bulk of my diet in any way. What else? Ethics of, oh, Ariana, let's see. So the question from Ariana is commitment to sustainability in my materials and the care that I'm talking about in the life of Ferment. So sharing my broader thinking around ethics of creating art at this moment of impending climate extinction. That's a really, really hard question because I am a studio-based artist who uses like all kinds of materials, and the sources of those are vast as well. But I do have to show you, I have these props off to the side for the right questions. But this is something, I'm experimenting with kombucha leathers and working on molding them. So this is the same mold that I use for those cabbages. That's aqua resin, not a environmental or sustainable material. And this is kombucha. And so I'm using, thank you. Yeah, so I'm using the kombucha, and I'm using a dehydrator. And what I do is put the kombucha SCOBY. So I'll like peel it apart or cut it up or whatever, and put it in a Vitamix. And often it needs a little water to blend it. Once you get like a kind of jelly-like paste, like it's not super watery, you might have to experiment with consistencies if you decide to do this. But then I'll add food coloring. I think like I'll experiment with natural food, like beet or whatever, but I'm not really super particular about the fact that I'm going to use a synthetic food coloring to add to that kombucha. So I'm playing with that. I'm definitely thinking about it. It's on my mind personally. I don't have like prescriptions for anyone of what is like ethical as a totality. I'm interested in all the collective ways that people are thinking about it, and I think like social practice art, socially engaged art, in foregrounding the social and community aspects as part of the material. I think there's a way there to kind of shift what a cultural understanding of the emphasis of art is. Absolutely, like materials and things are so important and so relevant. But I think there's like a holistic kind of encompassing of what art practices mean, and that's why mine includes fermentation and different aspects of my life, and experimentation in the studio. And so I do struggle a little bit with what to do when, and how to kind of make changes. And again, I think it's slow to figure out if you're used to using certain materials, certain things have been available, and you've had a traditional, like in my case, someone asked what background do I have. As far as school, like I studied painting. I studied painting as an undergrad and as and in grad school. So in grad school, I started making sculptures and was interested in things being more challenging in terms of what I needed out of making, like paintings weren't quite doing it for me. So I started kind of branching out and making like sculptures. And that's, anyway, yeah, that's my artistic story. So yes, I've made art much longer than fermentation. But I will say that out of grad school, I started working for like a fancy wine store, and I became their beer person in New Haven. And so I was really interested in beer, but and alcohol, mostly through taste and flavor. And I kind of had this, wanted to develop this sophistication around understanding taste, and that was a part of it. So yeah, I wasn't making beer then. I wasn't brewing then. It took kind of a long time for me to figure out what I wanted to make. But because there were so many interesting things in the craft beer market that was like emerging in 2005 and 6 when I was doing that particular job, I kind of wanted to just study all of that, and I wasn't as interested in making it, if that makes sense. But I've sort of delved into mycology to answer Ishi's question. I haven't figured it out yet. I tried to grow some oyster mushrooms, and it like started, and yeah, so my mycology is like, I'm dependent on other people and super interested in working with people that are more knowledgeable about that. My work as a professor, what classes I'm teaching. Okay, this was Jess's question, and so if you see it, it's she's asking to hear more about my work as a professor and what classes I teach and how I share that work. So I started out teaching foundation, which is freshman level art at the Kansas City Art Institute. And that's just like this circus of kind of everything. So I do introduce it to them, and it's kind of in just again in this like interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary way, kind of showing students how science can fit into what they're doing, critical thinking, of course, and just all of the things that I'm mentioning. And then I taught painting for 2 years as well. I think for me, it's a balance of like responding to what students want to do themselves and how they're motivated themselves, responding to them, and then where they're curious, kind of pointing them in the direction of my interests as well. But sometimes I'll teach specific workshops or specific things, and with social practice teaching, there is sort of more room there to do things hands-on, or to have guests and visitors that get them into like gardening or fermentation as part of the instruction, if that answers the question. Do we have anything else? Other props. I have a lot of books right here, but I can also bring up, let's see, well, I have Sandor's new book right there. Title, Lori, oh, my wife was privately asking me to talk about the titles of my classes. Let's see. Well, I teach in terms of some of the classes I teach. I've taught a foundation workshop called Micro Macro, which looks at kind of scales of systems, and so there we really do get into the microbial and use microscopes, and then understand these kind of levels of systems. I taught a course on manifestos, so getting students to start to write out some of these bigger ideas and be connected to some bigger concepts, and an idea of voice. and voice in your work. And then I taught a class called Systems and Sustenance. So that looks at like our food from starting with like ingestion, and so I kind of start with the microbial, and then it goes out to food systems in terms of how, like, it goes out to the dining room and kind of the construction of dining room, and then bigger and bigger and bigger until we're like international, and we're talking about food justice and food systems internationally, and how that works. So it's a lot to get into like right here, but those are some of those ideas of the things I'm teaching. And thank you, Ishi. Where do you want me to teach? I want all of you to, let's do it together. I'm sure there's so many things. What's great about an event like this is that I know that all of you have just this incredible wealth of knowledge, and that really, like, having a discussion with you about this, which I realize is not what we're doing, but like in my mind, I am having this great discussion with all of you because I know your knowledge about these things is incredible. Yeah, some of the things I do here as well. I'm trying to work with more chefs and citizen science projects. So I worked with Chef Rick Mullins here, who's interested in a lot of these same issues and cooks with mostly local ingredients at the Kemper Museum's Cafe Sebastian. So yeah, I think working with chefs is really interesting, and actually I'd like to do a lot more of it. Especially when we can. But the thing that I did with Rick, we had Sandor Katz was here actually at the University of Kansas as a visiting scholar for about a week last year. Maybe it was, anyway, not like a year ago. And Sandor came to Kansas City from, Lawrence is an hour away where the University of Kansas is, to do a dinner with me and Rick Mullins at the Kemper Museum. And so we had this like multi-course dinner with a panel conversation with the three of us to start that out. And I made tempeh for everyone, and there were these like incredible collaborations that happened within that. Some of the other chefs that work there had made this like amazing like petri dish of a kind of kombucha, little like an amasake, like a little I don't even know what it was. It was just a wonderful kombucha gelatin, sweet gelatin thing that was incredible. So I think just doing more amazing things with chefs would be high on my list. For that, I also made a series of sculptures, actually, that you can see behind me. This is more props. So this sculpture, this one,